Good evening and welcome. We're very glad to have you here. My name is Rick Mullaney. I'm the director of the Public Policy Institute here at Jacksonville University, and we're very excited to have you all here tonight. We're all here tonight, I believe, for a very timely discussion, and I hope you would all agree. And so we're very glad to have you here, and we're especially appreciative of our special guests. Before we introduce them, however, I do want to recognize and thank some people. First, our presenting sponsor is St. Vincent's Healthcare. Jane Lanier is on our board, and she's with St. Vincent's. And we want to thank St. Vincent's for being the sponsor of the Policy Matters Lecture Series. I had the great privilege of serving on that board for 10 years, so I'm biased. I will tell you, for nearly a century, in fact, next year will be the 100-year anniversary of the Daughters of Charity coming to Jacksonville and establishing St. Vincent's Hospital. 3 acute care hospitals now in town with St. Vincent's, Riverside, Southside, and Clay County. 100 doctors in primary care, and a history and legacy of compassionate, excellent care. And we're very, very pleased to partner with St. Vincent's Healthcare. We're very pleased to have them as sponsor of this Policy Matters Lecture Series. Also want to recognize the former ambassador to the UN, someone who has been at the highest level for 30 years in strategy sessions in foreign policy, advising presidential administrations. And she's here with one of her classes, and that is former UN Ambassador Nancy Soderberg. Is Nancy here? Would you please stand? And I understand, Nancy, you're here with your class. Are they here? If they would stand up, we love to get. We love to have UNF students here, and we're just glad it's not a basketball game. I just thought I'd mention that. Sorry, just teasing. That was last year. Okay. Also, we're very, very pleased, by the way, to have a number of members of the board. We have another ambassador here, Marilyn McAfee. Where is she? Marilyn, if you would stand up. She's with the World Affairs Council, also an ambassador. And with her is General Jerry Maloney. Is that right? General, can you stand up for us? Thank you very much for glad. On the Board of Trustees, we're very pleased to have with us Fred Pruitt, who I know very well, Cindy Krumyak and her husband, Marty. Is that right? Thank you all for being here. I will tell you, as all of you know, or as many of you know, the Institute was founded 4 years ago. And one of the strengths of the Institute truly is an extraordinary number of in our Board of Advisors. And I do want to thank many of them for the role they've played in building this Institute, but also want to recognize several of them that are here. Gary Chartrand is here with his wife, Nancy. They have played a very instrumental role in the founding of the Institute from the very beginning. David Strickland, who's also with the World Affairs Council, is on the Board of Advisors, as of course is Jane Lanier. And so we're very, very pleased to have them with us as well. Let me just say this for those of you who may not be that familiar with it. 4 years ago in January, we had an idea that public policy was important to the future of the region and the state of Florida, and that this Public Policy Institute could play a constructive role in shaping the future of the region and the state of Florida. And so we created and established the first Public Policy Institute of its kind in the state of Florida. And we offer 4 graduate degree programs in public policy. We offer a master's degree in public policy, which is a 2-year program, very interdisciplinary study. And we offer 3 dual degree programs. An MPP degree plus, you can get your MBA through our business school. You can get your graduate degree in marine science through our marine science graduate program, or your law degree through the Florida Coastal School of Law. The foundation for the Institute is our academic program. Harvard conferred the first MPP degree in the country in 1971. We conferred the first MPP degree in the history of the state of Florida in April of this past year. We're very, very excited to do that in this area of the state of Florida. And let me say this, since it is the foundation and that is what this institute is all about, we are very pleased to have some of our MPP students and faculty here with us tonight. If you're an MPP student or faculty, would you please stand up? We like to say here at the Institute, we hope to shape the future really in 3 ways. One is through preparing a new generation of leaders. That really is fundamental to the future. This belief that public policy is so important to our future. The second is through public policy expertise, our faculty, our students, our research. But thirdly, it's about tonight. We hope that the Institute provides a neutral gathering place, Republicans and Democrats, people of diverse points of view, to come together to discuss critical public policy issues that we face in the state of Florida and our country and in fact in foreign policy, and that's what tonight is all about. As I mentioned, this is a part of the Institute's central mission. You may have seen we've had televised debates on campus, we've started polling, forums, and conferences, but we think tonight, when we're able to be fortunate enough to have some policy experts, particularly on one as important as this evening, that is an important part of what we're trying to do here at Jacksonville University and part of what we're trying to do here at the Institute. So what I'd like to do right now is to introduce the person who's actually going to introduce our guest speakers. Many of you know him. He's actually had a very distinguished career of nearly 50 years, and you probably know him as the superintendent of schools for Duval County. He served as superintendent from 1998 to 2005, John Fryer. During that time, the general counsel for the city of Jacksonville was me. And so I happened to be the superintendent's legal counsel during that time, and we've remained friends, and I want to thank him for making tonight possible. What you may not have known is what an extraordinary, distinguished career he's had in the military. He entered the Air Force in 1963. In his early assignments, he was an instructor pilot. He was a fighter pilot with the Southeast Asia Combat Tour. He was a deputy commander of operations and then commanded a tactical air command fighter wing. He was selected as a White House Fellow and is a distinguished graduate of the Air Command and Staff College and the National War College. He later served as senior non-British officer headquarters, United Kingdom Air Forces in London, before assuming duties as a military advisor to the UN ambassador to NATO. 32 years in the military, and in the last couple of years, he was the commandant of the National War College, the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. From there, he became superintendent of schools, and after that, he's been in the private sector as both the CEO of a company and vice president of a multi-billion-dollar company. Major General John Fryer has had a very distinguished career, very distinguished in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the nonprofit community. And we're very pleased and honored to have him here tonight to introduce our special guest.
I need to tell you a little about the National War College before I introduce our guest, because that's where we got to know each other. I was commandant 92 to 95, and both of them were on the faculty at that time. Actually, Jim was a student and became a member of the faculty. And so you need to know just a little bit about the National War College. About half of the faculty is military, with extensive operational experience, and they have to have academic credentials that are impressive as well. Many of them have PhDs. The civilian side are all people with doctorates in subjects related to national security policy, wide range of subjects, and we hire the very best across the country from the top colleges. They're not the typical kinds of professors you find. In fact, I've heard some professors describe a professor as someone who observes something that works in practice and wonders if it would work in theory. They're not those kinds of people. The National War College is located on a beautiful campus of Fort McNair downtown in D.C. If you've ever been there, it's in a nationally historic building, beautiful building. And it was first the armory for the United States. In fact, it was at the confluence of a lot of effluents at one time, and they had malaria and all that. But when they cleaned it all up, it became the first armory, and Lincoln used to go down there and watch them make guns. It's ironic because later they hanged Lincoln's assassins right there in the same place. It also was a site of Walter Reed's clinic where he invented the cure for yellow fever, and his clinic is still there, in fact. After World War II, Eisenhower, DeWitt, and others decided we needed to move the next step for preventing war as well as prosecuting wars in the future, and that was to build a real national security team. It's not all about the armed forces. It's about all of the instruments of power and the agencies in government that come together to prevent war and also help us prosecute it properly. So at the National War College, the students range across and the faculty also, from people from CIA and DIA to even GAO, and we had a wide range of students, and we had foreign students. In my last class there, for example, we had a Russian colonel who was KGB. We had a Saudi prince, whom Jim knows quite well, and we had an Israeli colonel, and that was quite a mixture for that year, for sure. Our job there was teaching national security strategy and policy, and national military strategy and policy. Each Commandant of the National War College has as his sidekick a U.S. ambassador. Mine was an ambassador from Yemen. But the very first ambassador there for the very first Commandant was George Kennan. If you know your diplomatic history, it was right there in the National War College in December of '46 that he wrote that famous X article that established the whole concept of containment that we use as a successful strategy during the Cold War. I invited him to come back to the National War College and made him a distinguished professor emeritus in a very nice ceremony, and he took us into the room where my ambassador was and showed us where he wrote that article, the same desk, changed the location a little bit, the same place. So it's an institution with a very rich history. And in fact, we're so good at blending people together on the faculty that Jim and Janet married each other there, and they had their wedding reception at our nice, beautiful three-story house there on the Washington Channel. And it was a very unusual wedding reception in that we played softball after. And when I called Jim to ask him if he would come here, he reminded me that I struck out the bride. So I'm sorry, I have not always used the best politically correct judgment. Well, I can tell you if you want to know any more about Janet, you can ask her because she wrote the official history of the National War College. So let me talk about her first. She has a PhD in international relations from UCLA. She was legislative director for Senator Pat Leahy. She was deputy staff director for the Senate Agriculture Committee. She spent 14 years at the National War College, was the first woman to chair the Department of National Security Strategy. She was named an outstanding professor of the college in 2006. She's written and lectured on strategy, culture, macroeconomics, Islam, women in Islam, and Saudi Arabia. She's lectured at Faisal University, Diplomatic Studies Institute, Cell A Women's Business Networks. She's consulted with Saudi women newly appointed to the Shura Council. As I said, she co-authored this History of the National War College. She still does international consulting, and you will see, as everybody has earlier today, she's just a delightful, warm, wonderful human being, and we just love her. Carol and I do very much. Dr. Janet Smith. And Ambassador Smith is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. He has a master's from Indiana University. He's a graduate of the National War College as well. He was the Air Force chair at the War College and professor of national security strategy. He's taught at universities around the world. Most importantly, I like to say he was a fighter pilot, because I was a fighter pilot. He commanded an F-15 fighter wing. He's commanded F-16 operations in a number of places, Japan to Tyndall. And I think one of the interesting stories he told me, and I repeated this afternoon, was Tom Clancy visited his wing when he was commanding one of these wings, and he took him up the ladder of an F-15 and started to describe the electronics, and Clancy looked at him and said, "Colonel, I don't care about any of that." He says, "I have people who write all that stuff. I just want to get inside the minds of the commanders." So I think that's what we're trying to do tonight, is not get in Ambassador Smith's mind, but the minds of the Saudis, and figure out how we can deal with the Middle East better. Jim served as senior executive at 2 multinational companies after he left the Air Force. He was the ambassador to Saudi Arabia between 2009 and 2013, and during that period of time, he focused very much on improving business with Saudi Arabia. And so business exports from the U.S. to Saudi Arabia doubled during his time as ambassador. He's done a lot of other things. He can tell a lot of stories, and I think you're going to enjoy this evening with them. This afternoon, it became really a conversation. It was a delightful one because there are a couple of people who have done a more insightful look at how the Saudis think and what that culture and what Islam does than anybody I've talked to. So I think you can ask anything you want. From ISIL to, what are we going to do about the future of the Middle East? And I think you're going to enjoy both of these people. So, Ambassador Jim Smith, come on up.
Well, it's great to be with you. It's great to be in a community that is so interested in the world. And because you don't see that everywhere, it's particularly good to see so many students here. I say that because you're inheriting a very challenging world. And very soon it's going to be your challenge, not ours, as we pass the baton off to you. And I hope you're here to learn. Most of you here are looking for answers. We don't even know the questions to ask for the next few years. So I treasure that you are here. If any of you are looking for advice on how to succeed in life, my solution was to marry the teacher. It worked for me. I doubt all of you can do it, but give it thought. A little background on by the way, I am wired like a guy who committed a very serious crime. And I've been asked not to move, so I'm trying to stay in one place. That's not what I normally do. In the American system, about 70% of ambassadors are career foreign service. So they grew up in the foreign service like John and I did in the Air Force, and you go from captain to lieutenant, and in our case, ended up in flag rank. About 70% of our ambassadors are career foreign service. There's about 30% of ambassadors who are political appointees. Most of these are people that bundled, work policy, and they normally go to places like Paris and London where it doesn't hurt to live. There's one place, though, that the country insists on a political appointee, and that's Saudi Arabia, because they want somebody who is close to the president. In their mind, they want somebody who can pick up the phone in the middle of the night and get the White House. I never had to do that for them, but that's what they want. So Saudi Arabia is, for a political appointee, what we call heavy lifting. And we were there over 4 years. And I will tell you that the Saudis as people are among the most warm, generous, hospitable people that I've ever met. And we traveled all 13 provinces in Saudi Arabia, and that was true wherever we went. The challenges of the region are very complex. But none of you have a visa to go travel to Saudi Arabia next summer on vacation, because Saudi Arabia doesn't allow tourist visas. So Saudi Arabia is a mystery, except to businessmen who have a business visa or those of us in the diplomatic service who were there. So it is a mystery. So therefore, most of the information you get is somewhat disinformation. We'd like to talk about that some tonight. I represented over my career 2 different and very distinct cultures, and this is really for the students doing public policy. In my first career in public service, I was in the military and wore a uniform for 32 years. In my second career in public service was as a diplomat. We're talking about 2 fundamentally different cultures in the organizations. The military is an action-oriented organization. They get things done, action-oriented. The diplomacy is a cerebral culture. Now, if you take these to the extreme, you have those who think without doing and those that do without thinking. And neither of those is quite right. But if you can pull the best of both together in the decision process about what to do, you actually have something very, very powerful. So if you're watching news, and I don't care if it's MSNBC, Fox, or CNN, or Al Jazeera, and you're only hearing somebody talk about a military solution, half the answer. If you've got somebody talking about a political solution with not understanding the political, diplomatic, information, economic dimensions, you only have part of it. So for those of you students looking at public policy, make sure you've got all of it together. Janet and I were privileged to be called and asked to go to Saudi Arabia. I call myself an untrained ambassador because I did not grow up in the Foreign Service. And as a job, it was one that required every skill set that I'd learned along the way, including my time growing up on a farm, because you'll be amazed at the number of decisions you have to make just based on common sense, which doesn't always exist in the bureaucracy. As an ambassador to a country, you actually work for the president. You're the president's personal representative in that country. And the way the letter from the president reads, you work for the president through the Secretary of State, which means anybody other than the President or the Secretary of State who tells you to do something, you can always say no. And this, if you go back to the days of Iran-Contra, that was because the NSC was doing things and asking ambassadors to do things in countries, saying it was the word of the President. If the President or the Secretary doesn't tell you that a policy issue, it actually does not exist. The Saudi weekend was Thursday and Friday for the 3 years I was there. It's now shifted to Friday and Saturday. So you essentially work 7 days a week, because your weekend was Thursday and Friday. Washington did not acknowledge that weekend. They clean out their in-basket on Thursday and Friday, and you're getting all their work, and then you start again on Saturday. But what you find in this job, and again, it's a great privilege to represent the President and the American people and our values. It's a 24/7 job, 7 days a week. And you're out in the desert and a Bedouin comes up to you. He's probably never been to the United States. He's probably never met an American. And his view of this country is going to be based on one conversation. And that was the job of being an ambassador and representing this great country and our values. I want to move a little bit to what's going on in the region. And I'm going to offer you 7 trends that have been impacting the region over the course of the last 70, 80 years, some more recently than others. And this is a context through which you can look at the problem today and see how these forces have come together to create what I can basically call a mess, and perhaps an unsolvable mess. The first of those is an Islamic awakening. And this goes back to 1928, the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo, which gathered steam in the 30s and 40s. It was set back a little bit after the coup in 52. Got additional steam with Sid Qutb, his book Milestones. And that was the first time this idea of jihad as a method of overthrowing governments that you do not agree with entered into the lexicon of the Muslim world. Go on the website for Muslim Brotherhood, and they're very clear on the website. Their objective is to replace the governments in the region with Islamic states. That hasn't changed. What happened, though, is all of this morphed over to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf after Sadat kicked them out of, or Nasser first kicked them out of Egypt. And in fact, Osama bin Laden's brother, Mohammed, taught Islamic studies in Jeddah at King Abdulaziz University for many years. And you see this movement morphing into the jihadist movement of the freedom fighters going to Afghanistan. After that rolled up in 89, 90, they came back to Saudi Arabia. Their target then became the Saudi government. That didn't work, so they went to the far enemy, which was the United States. 9/11 is the result of that. Reformed in Saudi Arabia, and then the bombs started going off in Riyadh in June of 2003 to December of 2005, and in the form of the global jihadist movement. And that's what Osama bin Laden was all about. But this is an Islamic awakening which interprets all of the problems of the region being the fault of the West and the governments that the West has put in place. You also have another trend, which is an Arab awakening. And I really classify that separate and distinct from the Islamic awakening. And I go back to January of 2010 and looking at the TV with the crowds at Tahrir Square, trying to understand what was going on. And what struck me at the time was there were no American flags being burned. There were no British flags being burned. There have been a lot of British flags burned in Cairo over the generations. There were no Israeli flags being burned. And I realized this was not about us. It was not about somebody else. It was about them and their problems and their issues. And I thought about this in a while, and I realized for the first time in 700 years that was the case. Because Baghdad in the 13th century was the Dar al-Hikmah. It was the house of wisdom. It was a center of knowledge for the world, it and China. All of the Greek classics had been translated. We got all of the work in astronomy and medicine. Arabic numerals that we got, that's a standard for us, came from Baghdad in that time. And then the Mongols came and leveled it all. They were there about 300 years. And then the Ottoman Empire rolled in. They were there about 300 years. And after World War I, Britain and France drew lines that we live with today. At the end of World War II, you got the Soviet Union on one side, United States on the other, pick one. Saudis picked us, Egypt picked them. Kind of worked out better for the Saudis than it did Egypt until they turned course. And then at the end of the Soviet Union, when the Berlin Wall fell, we were the only, quote, superpower left standing. And I could never understand, in my 20 years of going in and out of the region, every conversation was about U.S. foreign policy. It ended up that way. What's the price of camels these days? Well, what about your policy on Israel? Until January 2010, it was no longer about us. The conversation was about them. So you've got an Arab awakening that says, yes, this region has underperformed the rest of the world, but the problem starts at home. It's about governance. It's about our own challenges. So that awakening, I see, is a very positive one. And then you've got the Arab Spring, which I define a little more narrowly than others, which is the response of governments to the Arab awakening. And those governments that responded to age-old measures of cracking down on their populations, well, they just fell apart. And that's Egypt, Syria, Bahrain started in that direction, reset. But those countries, and these were the monarchies of the Gulf, that responded to their population's needs, well, they remained stable. Okay, we've seen that changing a little bit, but by and large, the monarchies of the region, including the Saudis, were very responsive to the needs of their population. And this is about jobs and housing and corruption, the security apparatus, and a whole bucket of things that I call the evolution in civil society. The other trend that impacts things is this. And I'll call that the ubiquitousness of information. Because you have populations that historically only knew what their government told them. Only knew what their government wanted them to know. And now you have access to global information. So governments can't say one thing and do another. It changes the whole corruption idea. Because if you and I are having a conversation about a shady business deal, she is there with one of these to take a picture and push a button, and it's gone viral. So we may not have changed our ethical standard, but we sure do have to change our behavior because everybody is there to take a picture of it. So the ubiquitousness of information has changed the landscape in the region because the social contract between governments in the region and their people has been of government to subject. Government to subject. What's changed is people have a voice. And they have a right to a voice in the form of a BlackBerry or iPhone. They see themselves as citizens. They don't see themselves as subjects. And that completely changes how governments have to begin to respond. There's good and bad. There's a dark side to this, which leads into my next trend, which is the evolution from control to influence. In the context that I just talked to you about, governments have to influence people, not control them. In the context of what you're seeing with ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, whatever term you want to use. You see an entity that has mastered the tools of influence, while current governments are still focused on the instruments of control. Even though the world has changed because of this. So you see, Anonymous in the last 10 days has done more to shut down websites than any government has for the last several years. So what I would submit to you is that in the past, governments would control, and they control your movement, they control your information, they control where you go, what you think, and basically control your life. You can't control anymore. So if a government is going to be successful, they've got to influence behavior. For non-government activities, we are seeing a great capacity to command the instruments of influence and disregard the instruments of control. The instruments of control are checkpoints and armies and air forces and navies and tanks. And the instruments of influence are websites, communications. To counter those, much different instruments. It's dialogue, it's education, it's a whole range of things that, as of today, the other side has command. You cannot look at the region today without understanding the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran that goes back to December 1979. Two events happened. We actually think of that time as the takeover of our embassy. But really the rise of Khomeini in Iran and the takeover of the Holy Mosque in Mecca by Juhayman and his followers in December of 1979. An extremely important event in Islam and for Saudi Arabia. After that point, Iran undertook a coherent strategy of destabilization in the region. And they undertook that strategy to advance their governance model, which was the mullahs running the government, and to advance Shia Islam by destabilizing the region by focusing on conflict between Sunni and Shia in every part of the region. Politically, they did this, and it actually makes sense politically because they wanted their neighbors to be unstable and weak. And therefore, if their neighbors were weak, they're okay. And this goes back to the Iran-Iraq War. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, undertook a strategy of stabilization. And in their strategy, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars exporting what we all call Wahhabism. It's actually quietist Salafism, and advancing their version of Islam, which is ultra-conservative, intolerant, culturally and religiously, but not politically, because it goes back to the deal struck by the first Al Saud in 1742 with Muhammad bin al-Wahhab, which says that Saudi Arabia, before it was called Saudi Arabia, accepts this interpretation of Islam, and in exchange we will always support the government. And that is the deal that they struck 250 years ago. That is how the government operates now. It is a separation of church and state. The Al Saud family runs the government. The Al Sheikhs run the religion. They focus on the laws of God. The Al Sauds focus on the laws of man. In their mind, they were exporting stability to counter what Iran was doing. So Daesh today, in my view, is the result of failed foreign policy on the part of both Iran and Saudi Arabia. Because Iran wanted instability, you got Daesh. And they're marching east to cut the head off of every Shia they come in contact with. Not the kind of instability they had in mind. But the reality of it is, while you may create chaos, you can't control it. For the Saudis, they thought that they were exporting stability. After it leaves your border, you can't control it. The unintended consequence of their investment was they exported intolerance. Those two things together create the challenge that we've got today. Very briefly, I would submit to you that U.S. foreign policy in the region has had a very important impact as well. Desert Storm, we ousted Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Very important operation for an ally. But by staying there in Southern Watch, we helped to give life to the global jihadist movement. That was the unintended consequence of that. People will say, well, you caused all this when you invaded Iraq. No, all of these forces were coming together anyway. What we did do was blow the top off the kettle. And if, for those of you that play pool, you're at break and the cue ball hits and all the balls go in different directions, the invasion of Iraq caused that. I don't know what it would have looked like had we not invaded, but these problems were still there to deal with. I want to close by saying that people have often asked me what the most important part of my experience was. Saudi Arabia is unique because you need two ambassadors. Gender segregation. You would never find a meeting like this with men and women together. The men would be in one room, the women would be in another. So it's the one country that requires two ambassadors. So Janet and I would have breakfast in the morning. She'd go in this direction, I would go in this one and rejoin back, and that's when I would get my list of things to do. People knew that I worked for a woman. Most people thought it was Hillary Clinton, but it wasn't. But as I look back on it, it's something that we did together. And there's no way that I could have been successful without her, because I would have gotten reporting on half of the population from other men. Probably not very good. And I would argue that when you look at the future is going to come from this highly educated generation of young women coming along. It's a tidal wave of estrogen that's flowing across the country, and it's going to drown a lot of guys in its path. But with that, I'd like to invite Janet to come up.
It's hard to know what to say after your husband has said those things about you. It's lots of fun to be here with you. I like to see a combination. And can you hear me, by the way? Because my voice is sometimes soft. I like to see a combination of students and people from the community, because honestly, this is a puzzle we're all trying to think through together. And I'm going to just speak briefly tonight, because I think Q's and A's are a better way of kind of exchanging ideas. But let me just have two little parts to my talk. One is a very personal reflection of what it felt like to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, an American woman there, and then come back to some of the issues that Jim talks about in the bigger geostrategic context. I was the first wife allowed back in the country in 5 years as a diplomat's wife, because there were bombings, as Jim mentioned, in 2005, and all the families were evacuated. And so I really had no one to call to say, well, you know, what's the house like? What do I do? What's going to be going on? And Jim was a wing commander at a large base in Japan. So we had had that experience of doing something like this together in an overseas assignment. But I have to tell you in all honesty, and I've lived in Latin America as well as in Asia, that nothing really prepared me for this. It's such a unique and novel experience. And as Jim mentioned, there's no tourist visas to this country. And so I had this sense that I had a responsibility, not just to represent the United States as best I could, but to be the eyes and ears of all of you, to help convey to you what I saw. Because I came with very few preconceptions. I had some Saudi officers at the War College as students of mine, mainly Army colonels and one Air Force colonel. So I had some background, but I didn't major in Middle East studies when I was in college, and as you know, I worked on the Hill. So when I got there, I decided what I wanted to do, since even if Jim says I was another ambassador, I was an unpaid other ambassador, that's for sure. I thought what I really wanted to do was listen and use those first 3 years. We were there almost 5 years. We started our 5th year when we left. But in the first 3 years, I just wanted to listen to people and watch, observe. I didn't have a job I had to do. And obviously, as Jim mentioned, it's a gender-separated society. And I really wanted to understand this approach to life because it confounded me. I was in that first generation of women to enter the professional workplace in America. I graduated from college in '67. I went and got to my PhD, came to Washington. I was one of the few women who worked as a legislative director for a senator. So I knew what it felt like to be beginning something. So when I was in Saudi Arabia, I realized that I was in the process of watching an amazing transformation happen on this issue of gender. And let me just preface this by just talking about it. And for the women in the audience, I want you to come with me in imagining this. Imagine life that is totally separated. And the things I considered as wholesome I had to rethink that question because I think of wholesome as a mom and dad and kids playing baseball or watching their kids playing a sport. Mom and dad together, mom and dad at graduation, whatever. And I realized in Saudi I had to rethink this because one day I was talking to a Saudi woman friend of mine and I realized no woman had ever seen her son graduate from high school. And conversely, no father had ever seen his daughter graduate from high school. Because everything, social events, are gender separated. So a wedding, the night before, what we can think of as the wedding, the men get together and have dinner themselves with the groom and his family. The next night, usually, the women gather late at night, have a party, which involves, lots of socializing, women dance. It's only women. The bride comes out in a white wedding dress, and the groom comes in the very end of this activity just for some pictures. They leave. Usually the wedding starts at 11 o'clock at night and it ends about 5 o'clock in the morning as an all-women's event. I actually, by the way, came to the conclusion after many years of living there, I was too old to go to weddings. I couldn't stay up. I couldn't stay up all night long. You enter a Saudi home, and there's a door for women and a door for men. So women in life are really have a separate experience in life. And it was an interesting experience for me to have because it did make me rethink things. A lot of things about how does that work? If women are only socializing with women, you only talk to each other, and men only talk to each other. I actually began, by the way, to wonder, this is a prejudice on my part, but do men talk more when they're only with men? Women feel we need to talk to tell men what they're thinking. Right? Those of you who are married know what I'm talking about. And I wondered about that. I think for those of you who are majoring in linguistics or want to study this, it would be great to go to Saudi Arabia and do a couple, even those of you who are studying psychology, to look at some of the assumptions we make about life and marriage and everything else, and what does it look like differently when you're in a gender-separated situation. And I had the wonderful opportunity when we were there, as I mentioned before, to watch this amazing experiment. King Abdullah, who was the king during the time we were there, he passed on last year. But King Abdullah had a vision that education was a very important aspect of the future of that country. And he started a scholarship program. And right now, a Saudi student who has merit, good grades, man or woman, boy or girl, can get a full scholarship to go as far in academic pursuits as they want to go. So a woman says, I want to be a doctor or a surgeon, can get a scholarship to go to either college within Saudi Arabia or to come overseas to this country, and can continue on and get have a degree as a surgeon or as a PhD in something else, or an engineer. Right now, there are 100,000 Saudi students in the United States. The only other nation that has a portion of students is China. And in the DC area, for example, there are 2,000 Saudi women students, and just in the DC area. And I've started a tradition now that we're back home to have a monthly get-together, a tea or a networking event for the Saudi women. I can't do all 2,000, but I can do 50 each month, grad students and undergrads. When I think about this, and I'm going to make a few references here in a minute just to the culture, if you think about taking students, young people, from extremely conservative culture, more conservative than any culture I've ever lived in my life, and yet say to them, at 18, those of you who are parents here, would you send your child to Saudi Arabia for 4 years overseas? Different culture. It's an amazing experiment. What this puts in place is something I want to go to in a minute in terms of what this means for culture and what's happening with ISIS. Just a few other comments about women. Our image in the West is of women driving. I mean, this is the one visual issue. I'll talk about it all the time. Interestingly enough, almost every single Saudi woman I met when we lived there, and even now when they come and visit, that is not their number one issue. For some it is, and I don't want to dismiss this. There are some young Saudi women who are out there working on this question. Jim mentioned the iPhone or the cell phone. They all now are into YouTubing themselves when they drive. So they'll go out by themselves in the desert, drive a car, and take a selfie as they're driving. I think, oh my God, they're going to kill themselves doing this. But there is this kind of friction between how they want to get along in life and this idea of how are they going to get ahead. I lost my train of thought when I thought about YouTubing themselves. Anyway. One of the things I was looking at in terms of women is where are they going in this process of approaching the modern life? As I see them here and realize that they're being exposed to a new world, I notice a couple things. One is they all told me they don't, when I asked them, are you married, the students that are here? And all of them said to me, no, we don't want to get married till we have our master's degrees. That's interesting. That's going to be a very big social change in terms of not getting married at 18, but getting married at 26, 27, whenever they do that. They're entering professions. Right now, again, I know I was talking about driving. Our image is about driving, but right now what's happening is the Saudi government wants to hire women. As long as there's a separate facility, once again going back to gender separation, as long as there's a separate facility, they are fine with women engineers. They are fine with women doctors. There's not that same image that we have in our mind about glass ceiling. So the question for them and their image of what is important is that they would like to change, for many, many Saudi women, they would like to change the notion of guardianship, which is the idea that, again, going back to ancient days, that you had to have a man be your guardian, either your husband, your father, to give you permission to leave the country, to go to school, even sometimes to get medical treatment. When I looked at that issue, and I tried to struggle with it myself, one day we were driving through the desert, and I saw a black tent of a Bedouin. There still are Bedouins who are nomadic people throughout the desert. And I looked at this tent, and I realized this is a square black tent in the middle of the desert. The winds are blowing. There's no protection. And in ancient times, marauding groups would come through the desert. And that at that sense of culture and history, you kept women inside, out of sight, protected, because you had no other protection. There's no water in Saudi Arabia. There's no bricks. There's no concrete at the time. These olden times there is now. And so those cultural traditions about keeping women inside and protected, I could get a sense of that, of why even modern women now still are comfortable in that culture. There is that in them of that vulnerability. Now I'm telling you some of these stories about women to say this culture is unlike any other culture I ever saw. It pushes back on you. If I wasn't with Jim, if I wasn't representing the United States, if I was getting off an airplane, I would have an abaya on. It's the only country I've ever gone to where I had to dress the way I was expected to dress. I didn't cover my hair. I found a verse in the Quran that said if a woman was past childbearing age, you did not have to wear the outer garments. And since I not only had gray hair, I have my Medicare card. And I thought, get back. I'm way past. That traditional feeling of modesty, gender separation, following a religious tradition that very, very much emphasizes rules and regulations, practice. It's every day. And again, as Americans, I think it's important to think about how does it feel if you have the idea that every single day of your life you're waking up before the sun rises for prayer, and you're praying 5 times a day, every single day, and you make references to God constantly in your conversation. So the idea of religion as being life itself, I wanted to try to understand that. What did that feel like? I'm used to saying prayer maybe 3 times a day before meals, but the idea of how they approached religion, really, I wanted to have a feel about that. The conservative quality about this and the fact that civil society is basically not allowed in Saudi Arabia. There are no civic organizations. There's no bar association. There's no medical association. Life is centered around family, not professional organizations. So the family, the tribe is very, very important. And what I want to leave you with is this kind of challenge to all of us. When I was at the War College, I taught a lot about the Cold War and strategy and how you think about strategy. And how do we think about war and conflict? During World War II, and I think for most of us in this room, especially people who have gray hair like me, we think of war as World War II. Tanks over the fields, air forces protecting, fighting over land in Europe or in Asia. That's war. In the Cold War, we expanded the idea of it wasn't just a military conflict, because if you think at the time, we were not trying to convert Hitler to becoming a Democrat. Right? We just wanted to defeat Hitler. We didn't want to change Hitler. During the Cold War, we said, okay, there is a military aspect. There is the Soviet Union. It's a powerful nation. It had nuclear weapons later on, and a powerful nation. We had to have alliances. We had to have NATO. We had to have a strong military to contain, as General Foriegn mentioned, to contain both physically the Soviet Union's expansion, but we also recognized that an aspect of the Soviet Union was an economic idea. It was Marxism. It was an idea that tried to address social, economic and social injustice. So we turned our attention then to all the nations of the world that were poor, and we started foreign aid. We tried to address those issues of economic need in Africa, Asia, etc. So we expanded our idea of strategy to say there's a military component and an ideology, an ideological component. To me, what confounds us right now, and I think, honestly, I think it confounds every single presidential candidate, it confounds all of us. In that, yes, there's a military component, Jim mentioned that. But this new question is, to me, not so much about the West versus Islam, but what we're watching is this profound discussion within Islam, among Muslims themselves, to talk about what to do about the modern world, what to do about iPhones, what to do about all of the pressures that globalization brings. This is a discussion and a fight and a debate within the community of Muslims, both Shia and Sunni. It has implications for us, the West, for China, for Europe, no question about it. But as Americans, I feel myself, it's awkward to talk about religion. We have a very private sense of religion. If you want to be a Buddhist, fine. If you want to be Muslim, fine. These are choices. This is a private practice feeling we have. We believe in freedom of religion. It's difficult to think about this in terms of national security. So I want to leave you with that puzzlement in my own mind. How do we think through this question? We are watching a historical time. These forces coming over Saudi Arabia, over Iran, over the Middle East, over Syria. These are civilizational forces. And we happen to be in the midst of it. It always reminds me of, and I'll end with this. We all know, especially those of you going into law enforcement, you know that if you get called for a domestic violence situation, a fight between a husband and a wife at home, and they're fighting each other, and you get called as a policeman, many, many times the policeman comes to the door, the couple quits fighting themselves and starts fighting the policeman. You're the outsider coming in. to an eternal, passionate family fight. And honestly, that's the way I felt that I was watching this change while I was there. So again, I think Jim and I could do questions.
Can you add one more thought, Janet? You've talked about it with us, and that is, in terms of this fight within Islam, the barrier to creativity which they seek so much because of the limitations of not being able to talk about religion. Can you address that a little bit?
Again, when we lived there, I constantly was forced to reevaluate my own assumptions. Whenever you live overseas, you always have a clear idea, a little bit more about your own country and your own culture and stuff. And so we make assumptions about problem solving, decision making. And I realized when I was talking to Saudis and how they approached issues, and one example of this is in K through 12 education. They want to compete globally in the world market. All countries want their children to have jobs. And they know to be competitive in the global economy, you have to develop critical thinking for their young students. They hire consultants. Many different companies they spent a lot of money hiring consultants to say that. You need to go from rote learning and memorization of simply the Quran or memorization in class to more creative, analytical thinking. They know that is needed. They have had a very hard time making that move because so much of, let's say, the culture, the historical experience has been in this more traditional model, and because there is a sense that Islam itself can only be sustained in adherence to itself. In other words, the idea of questioning, and Jim mentioned Said Qutb in terms of milestones, he made this proposal that it was dangerous to study comparative religion, philosophy, political science, because you will lose your faith. Now, this is not unique just to Islam. The Catholic Church has had this debate over the history of the Catholic Church. That's so influenced, though, higher education in the region that I would go to universities. They have wonderful universities in Saudi. I would see a business school, an engineering school, a medical school, a K-12 teaching school. That's it. My last story about this question goes to this issue. A wonderful woman we know, young Saudi woman lawyer, went to London for law school. She gets to London, very smart girl. She passed the New York bar after she finished law school in London. She gets to London, she's walking around, and she sees various monuments to World War II. And she told me, and she was talking to an audience about this, that her very first thought when she saw these is that there must have been a World War I. So it is critical thinking. It's what I would call, from my perspective, chewing on the ideas of mankind. What is justice? What's representation? All these issues that you all students should be studying, that is the challenge right now. They're right on the edge of figuring out a way to do that. So thanks so much.
One of the topics we've seen in the Democratic debate and in the presidential debate has come up several times is this notion that U.S. foreign policy didn't adequately consider what Libya would look like post-Gaddafi, or that U.S. foreign policy didn't adequately consider what Iraq would look like post-Saddam Hussein. And my question is, if militarily we can defeat ISIS, which controls large parts of Iraq, and we can defeat Syria, which now controls large parts of Syria, what does Syria look like post-ISIS, and what does Iraq look like post-ISIS?
What do you mean by defeating ISIS?
They no longer control it geographically. Right now, certainly some of the pundits would say, because they control property or area as big as Belgium, that they control the oil, that they control the revenue, that they control the land. and that one of the pieces of destroying ISIS is to destroy them militarily so that we now control it, or who, that's part of my question. I don't know who controls it. I don't know if you begin to carve up Iraq so that part of it goes to the Kurds. I don't know if Syria reverts to Assad. I don't know what you do. So I'm asking you.
Well, first of all, it's not what we do.
Or what they do.
At the end of the day, it's going to be what they do. The challenge with Daesh is, while we may attrit them in the field, they are going to be capable of morphing in a different direction. So for those of you that keep track of this, go home and Google the town of Sirte in Libya.
S-I-R-T.
And it appears that because of the attrition of Daesh forces in Iraq and Syria today, the anecdotal evidence of defections, that some of their leadership is moving to Libya, and it's very possible that we, in the near future, can show pretty good success against them in the field, only to see them morph in a different place where we have almost no capability to target them directly. So this whole notion of defeating Daesh or ISIS or ISIL is an elusive term. But the question is, what does the region look like? And that depends on the players in the region. The problem in Iraq has been since the beginning of the Maliki government, is the failure of the central government in Iraq to guarantee minority representation. So people in Iraq see that the government is supportive of the Shia population, dismissive of the Kurdish population, and openly antagonistic toward the Sunni population, which is mostly in Al-Anbar and to the west. If that government will ever come together and support minority representation, acknowledge its role as being responsible to all of the people of the country, you can hold it together. If they don't, then it's entirely possible that you take Baghdad or south of Baghdad and Basra, and that becomes part of Iran. So you have Shiistan, and then the rest of the Sunni community, which is Al-Anbar to the west, becomes Sunnistan, in whatever form that is, and then the Kurds are in the middle, with no access to the sea, hostile neighbors in the form of Iran, and Sunnis to the south, and Turks to the north and west. So there's no good solution unless we can convince that government in Iraq to support minority representation, minority rights. Syria is a much more complicated issue, and that is one where the community of nations needs to come together and think through what are the plausible solutions. The focus now is on Bashar al-Assad, but the reality of it is he is not going to be a legitimate ruler however you frame this thing. Because, once you've killed 250,000 of your countrymen, he's not likely to win an election, even in Florida, okay? So you have the problem of legitimacy with the current ruler, no matter how it works out. For me, I think the real issue is to get past that. The focus should be on only one issue, which is stop the killing. And the focus should be on us working with Russia and China and Iran, as well as the rest of Europe, on a solution that stops the killing and now go from there.
I take a slightly different view, and what I mentioned before. All of these questions, as Americans, and especially military guys, we love to solve problems. I feel it in myself. And so we want to do something and solve a problem. And I don't know how to actually explain this. I hope this is the beginning of a period where people in the region can come together to figure out these basic questions. Because I kept looking for Islamic political theory. In other words, I studied the history of the Islamic world, which is primarily a history of authority structures, kings, tribal chief, a military dictator. So most countries have an authority, a strong authority structure. And so what Jim was alluding to, when you get to the questions about groups, the most basic question in humankind is how do groups deal with each other that live near each other without killing each other? Basic question. 2 tribes, 3 tribes together? Those types of questions, minority rights, representation of interest, division of resources, these are basic questions in political science and governance. I'm hoping, it would be nice if they had this institute there, actually in Riyadh and in Damascus and in Beirut. I mean, there are efforts that are started. There are no think tanks right now really in Saudi Arabia. They're just starting this idea. But having a forum where people could come together without fear among themselves at the basic level to talk about what do we want to do with each other, with the Kurds, with the Alawites, with the different small groupings of people, with the Shia, with the Sunni. These are basic questions of humankind. And because of the tradition of authority structures, they just haven't been broached before. So we can't help, we will try to solve these things. They receive this in the region. When I would read the news, and they'll say, there's a Western plot to draw new lines as an imposition. And the answer to that, to me, to the feeling of an imposition, is to come together themselves to come up with a solution to their own problems.
My question is, General Abazad, gave a great speech at the World Affairs Council, and he talked about some things, and I wonder if you could expand on them. One, he said we're in a long war situation. We need to know our enemy, we need to mind our gaps, and we need to follow the money. My question to both of you is, who is supporting them financially? ISIS, and where are they getting their resources from? Yes, oil, but who's buying it? The black market, does it exist? Where does it exist? Specifically. Okay. The other thing is how do we mine the gaps? You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do we get other countries in the region to work together to defeat ISIL? And then lastly, maybe if you want to touch on it, what was what do you think Turkey's motivation was for shooting down a Russian jet? Article 5, you could, bringing in NATO, just thought, so I give you lots of questions. I know you maybe can't answer all of them, but those are some that I had. Thanks.
Well, first of all, on Turkey, they had called in the foreign minister. Turkey had called in the Russian ambassador about 10 days before the shoot down and showed him the evidence of them violating Turkish airspace routinely. He said, enough. Okay, stop doing it or we're going to shoot you down. And that's what happened. Now, what's interesting is it's becoming apparent that everybody's story is true, that the Russian pilot backseater says he was never warned, and the Turks say, we warned you 10 times. I'm reading now that the Russian Air Force never modified their airplanes with the communications equipment that allowed them to receive international guard transmissions because they'd only flown them inside of Russia and you never needed them. Okay? So it's entirely possible that he was warned 10 times, but his radios didn't translate. So that falls into the category of a missed opportunity to work together. I think they'll work through that one. The second issue is follow the money. The money is self-generated. There is a black market on antiquities. So as they raid museums and whatnot. There's a black market on that they're earning money from. There is a black market trade on a whole range of things, including bakshish in every community that they go into, like Tikrit, and the shop owners are having to pay tax and fees and whatnot. And then the oil is being sold to anybody that will buy it. So you find Iraqi citizens will end up buying oil from them because they can't get it from their own government. So there are flag tankers out there that are not tracked by international flag carriers. There's all sorts of ways of smuggling oil, and that's what they're doing it. So if you look at the Kinetic campaign, it's focused on targeting the access point for the oil because it's actually very difficult to follow the money and interdict it downstream.
Well, again, this is why this is such a hard issue. What I didn't hear his talk, but it sounds like a good talk that General Abizaid gave in a very traditional geostrategic way. Men on the chessboard, and where are you moving things, and what do you do? And that is true. That's part of this. What I'm trying to get at is motivation and these deeper questions that influence this issue of motivation. And the difficulty is that, again, in a culture where you're raised in a very similar way, and that your religious belief is such an important part of life, and ISIS, I'm just going to use the word ISIS because that's the word we use, the Islamic State group, they are touching on some of those traditions. You know, the Quran has different parts of it, like the Bible, like most religious books. There are some parts that relate to war. There are some parts that relate to more peaceful things. But if you think of that the whole Quran itself is the word of God, then you always have, we want to make sure you're not making the wrong choice here. So it's such a deeply, profoundly complicated issue that, again, General Abizaid is correct. This is a long activity. But my view is, how can you maintain the security you need while acknowledging the civilizational internal question within that group?
I'm Dr. Ellen Wald. I teach Middle East history here at JU. I also write and consult about the oil industry, particularly the Middle East. And so my question is for both of you. Oil Minister Ali al-Naimi and others have said, they've described oil in Saudi Arabia as a gift from God, and exploiting that oil is the work of men. And you mentioned in your discussion about religious culture in Saudi Arabia that religion is life itself there. And so I was wondering if you, both of you, could maybe comment on the role of oil in Saudi Arabia, both in terms of a business, but also in terms of religion and culture. How do the Saudis see their energy industry? Is it something they view as kind of separate from society, or is it more deeply ingrained?
Well, a couple of stories on Ali al-Naimi first. He's an oil minister. He was the son of a Bedouin. And his mother sent him away. His mother and father are divorced. His mother sent him away to live with his father when he was 8 years old because Aramco had started a school and he wanted both of his sons to get an education. So his schooling started in the American school in Dhahran, which was an Aramco school. So I asked him one day, I said, well, what was the first word you learned? He said, rabbit. I said, what are you talking about? So you remember in the schools where you had the alphabet all around and cards all around above the blackboard and whatnot? Well, that day they were studying R, and it was a rabbit. And that's the first word I learned in either Arabic or English. So at 13, he was hired to, actually his older brother passed away. He replaced his older brother as a copy boy, office boy in Aramco. And as he tells the story, he's gone full circle in his career because he started his career moving papers from one side of the desk to the other, and as the oil minister, he moves papers from one side of the desk to the other. A wonderful person and a great storyteller. His predecessor as the oil minister had a great quote, which I think says a lot about how the Saudis view oil. And he was known to have said that the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of rocks. And the oil age is not going to end because you ran out of oil. It's going to end when something comes to replace it. So most people see this as a transitory event in time. Many Saudis will tell me that oil has been both a blessing and a curse. That has brought riches beyond description, but caused Saudi Arabia to leapfrog over the generations of evolution in public policy and you name it. If you think about it, you know, prosperity well number 7 in Dhahran broke in 1938. That was when they first struck oil. This all went on the back burner during World War II. You had the meeting between King Abdulaziz and Franklin Roosevelt on February 14th, 1945. And after the war, we established this bilateral relationship. And they started pumping oil by the early 50s, but not really enough to impact until the 60s. It really wasn't until 73 in the oil embargo where the price of oil shot up that it caused enough revenue to fundamentally impact the infrastructure of the country. That's 50 years. 50 years. And arguably, if it hadn't been for that, we would be reading about the Nejdi in National Geographic. So now you've got a city of 7 million people in Riyadh, the huge metropolises, and they didn't go through all of the generations of evolution in public policy and you name it to build that society. And Saudis will tell you that's been the curse. It's also a curse because, you know, the old standard, the first generation makes money, the second generation holds on to it, and the third generation wastes it. And the third generation is of age now. So they have a big challenge with young men that don't work like their grandfathers used to work. So it is both a blessing and a curse.
Sure. I'm the policy advisor to the commander of Fourth Fleet here. I'm currently serving Foreign Service Officer. I did serve 12 years in the Middle East, including 2 years in Riyadh, where I was actually the oil reporting officer in the econ section. We've seen I think probably the last of the sons of Abdulaziz ruling the kingdom. We seem to be moving to the next generation, the grandsons of Abdulaziz. What do you think the fact that many of them have been educated in the United States or in other Western countries, what impact is that going to have on the alliance between the Al Sheikh and the Al Saud?
Well, starting with, King Salman was the last of the sons of Abdulaziz that were educated in the royal court. After him was Prince Satam, who's passed away now, but everybody else after him was educated in the West, mostly in the United States. The assumption will be that Mohammed bin Naif is next in line, unless Prince Ahmed finds a way to move back in. That's highly unlikely, but it's possible. So all that next generation was educated in the West. You see the impact of that on the critical thinking by the leadership now, because you see with Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Naif, some moves toward modernizing the economy, focusing on the private sector, and some fundamental shifts in where they're going. What's going to be interesting is and I know your question focused on the Al Sheikh and the religious community. You've always got to play to your base. I mean, you see this in the debates. Until there is a tectonic shift in alliances, one would assume that the agreement between the Al Sheikhs and Al Sauds will stay in place, and the ruler has got to genuflect to that base. And you see this in really subtle ways. The Shura Council is their Senate, 150 people. 53% of that Shura Council are modernizers. 47% are conservatives. Everything is ever so slightly in favor of the modernizing group. But it's on a trajectory toward modernization. What'll be interesting to watch here, and I don't know the answer, is traditionally the Al Saud family has seen its base being the religious community. But you saw King Abdullah periodically cutting off a slice of that power. With the ascension of Mohammed bin Salman as the deputy crown prince, it's clear they've made a conscious decision to put a young person in a key leadership role so that population, 60% under 30, sees an identity to the government. It may well be that they see that their future base is not just the conservative community, but the younger generation. And if that's true, and I don't know yet, then it will be a tectonic shift away from the traditional base.
Because he's only 30.